Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Laura Lodge with Start a Brewery, and I'm excited to welcome you to our second quarter educational webinar in partnership with Craft Beer Professionals. We've certainly covered a lot of ground with these webinars, and I'm super excited to do another. We started with trademarks. We've gone through employee handbooks, sales territory plans, raising investment capital, considerations before you purchase an existing brewery, and distribution relationships in the fourth quarter. And I'm super excited to welcome John from Inland Island Yeast Laboratories today. We haven't really gone into the world of ingredients, and so I'm really excited to start with yeast and to welcome John. So, John, tell us a little bit about your background, and then let's start out with the never ever, like somebody who hasn't even gotten past the business plan yet. What should they be thinking?
Great. So first of all, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and help educate everybody out there. But it's cool to be kind of the first in the supply side of things. It's one of those things. I think that it obviously the business planning and doing all the number stuff is very, very important. But once you get into the brewing and kind of the supply side, it's maybe a little bit more fun and maybe a little bit more the passion project that people are getting involved in this. So my background is basically I started in pharmaceuticals, went to school for biology, moved to California and got the first job that I could find. And it just so happened to be in a cell culture suite. So I was growing mammalian cells and making a cancer therapeutic, which was very similar to brewing, outside of the fact that I was wearing a bunny suit and we were in a completely enclosed, HEPA filtered clean room. It was, very, very similar to brewing, using tri-clamps and hoses and CIPs and everything. And from there, I went to grad school. I got a job in biofuels, which is where I started working with yeast. All of the ethanol that goes into your car, the 15% that you see at the gas station is the same exact ethanol that's in beer. And big production facilities making biofuels are very, very similar to really large, pretty filthy breweries. So it was kind of a completely different side of growing cells working there versus the pharmaceutical plant.
So are we going to run cars on beer?
We could. I mean, if you could make beer at 99% ethanol, I'm sure. If you put beer in your car, it's not going to work out very well, but you can run a car on Everclear, surprisingly enough. It's not particularly good for it, but there's a lot of gas pumps nowadays that'll say E85, and that's actually 85% ethanol over gasoline. So and that is the same ethanol that is in your beer, albeit, treated a little bit differently. So, I got into brewing kind of I found a niche industry that uniquely needed some, expertise in the yeast world. There was already a couple companies started Inland Island about 10 years ago. Very similar to the way that a lot of other people started breweries back then. I think that starting a brewery 10 years ago was a little bit different than it was today. You could get away with a lot more. And my first passion was to go and try to start a brewery, but recognizing what I was good at and not coming from a brewing background into this field, I focused on, the thing that I knew, which was growing yeast. At the time, I thought I was one of maybe 5 total yeast laboratories in the country. Turns out there were about, half a dozen to a dozen that started right around the same time. And there's still not a ton of us out there, but, a couple of like my competitors like Omega and Imperial Yeast started at the exact same time. And we've all, kind of found our space within the industry as well, which is cool, but no good idea happens in a vacuum. And then, 10 years of doing this, I've talked to a lot of breweries. I've helped a lot of breweries start up. I've had this conversation many, many times with, from the brand new brewer that's just even thinking about doing it all the way to a brewery that's been operating for a decade or two and is looking to kind of get more into the science and lab side of things. So this is a subject that I'm very, very familiar with. So
let's dump your head out.
Yep. So I can go from there. So kind of starting where you were saying, like a new brewer or a new brewery in planning, somebody that maybe, they don't have their space picked out. They're not really sure about things. What should they start thinking about with yeast? One of the things that I would hope is maybe that they're coming from somewhere where they've been doing some home brewing. They're familiar with how yeast works with their beer. And maybe they got a couple favorites that they like using, at the homebrew scale or for any of their scaled down test batches. it's very important that you kind of decide what kind of brewery you want to have. So it's going to make a big difference what kind of yeast you're using. If you're going to be an all German lager brewery, or if you're going to be a Belgian brewery, or if you're picking one particular type of beer to stick with, or maybe you're going to go IPA heavy, all of those are going to require a different kind of yeast and maybe a different type of strategy as far as yeast management goes within that brewery. So first and foremost, I would say kind of decide, and knowing that the type of beer that you want to produce is going to dictate what kind of yeast you have to bring into the brewery and what kind of yeast you have to manage in order to make those beers. So you might take it easy on yourself. I mean, going all lager, from a yeast management standpoint, would actually be a lot easier than a lot of these, breweries out there that it's cool to have beer from all over the world. And you got your little pub on the corner somewhere and you want to have English beer and Belgian beer and German beer. And the only way to do that is to have a bunch of different kinds of yeast in-house, and they need to manage those. So I think historically, it was more kind of the other way around. The yeast that you had dictated what kind of beer you made, because there weren't yeast labs. Yeast labs kind of, even the ones that have been around for a long time, like White Labs and White Yeast, I think White Yeast started in 1988. So before that, if you were running a brewery, you really did have to manage all of the yeast in-house, have it somewhere you could get it, or at least have some friends that if something happened to your yeast or you needed to get some more, you could always go to the brewery down the street. And I think what that did is really create the different styles and the different beers that were really symbolic of a different region. Because if you only had one type of yeast, you're only making that one style of beer, that beer then becomes indicative of that region. And in Europe, from what I understand, that is kind of the way it goes. You go to a brewery and they have the one beer they make because they've got the one yeast strain that they're able to just continually perpetuate within the brewery. That's not really, yes, yeah.
So are there breweries, is it a conscious decision then at that point to decide if you want to use a selection of different yeasts or if you want to just stick with one? Are there breweries who just base everything off that yeast and riff different directions?
Absolutely. And I think that oftentimes at this point, like you haven't even really got off the ground yet. Most aren't thinking about that kind of thing. And it can, like, yes, if you decide that you want to just make, some IPAs, you're going to be IPA heavy and you pick one yeast that you can just make, 10 different brands off that one, you're going to make life a lot easier on yourself. If you go in and you say, yes, I want to have a Hefeweizen and I want to have a lager and I want to have an English stout and I also want to have a Belgian, table beer, you've now got 4 different yeasts that you have to manage within that brewery. And I don't think that a lot of that is something that a lot of new brewery and planning do. I think the tendency is just to say, I want to have all the cool stuff. And I want to, brewers that I've met that came from large production facilities or had quite a bit of experience before they did open their own brewery tend to, in my experience, push towards one strain making 80% of their styles. And then they'll do a one-off every once in a while or something small. But understanding that it's expensive to run a bunch of different kind of yeast, especially if you can't perpetuate them and get a bunch of generations out of them. But most breweries in planning or most new breweries that open up are usually trying to run quite a bit, and they're not super concerned about the costs coming out the gate. They're like, look, we got all our loans. We've spent so much time and money getting everything put together. Like, let's just get beer cranked out. And I see breweries or new business owners wasting some money on yeast management right out the gate because it's not something they really thought about before they got there.
Right. And if you were thinking ahead and you were actually aware of this at the planning stages, would you plan for specific equipment or a specific amount of space, whether that's refrigerated or a lab?
Absolutely. And that both of those things, it's kind of segues really well into the next piece was what equipment should I be purchasing to manage or do what I need to do within the brewery. So if I've decided that I am going to run several different kinds of yeast, well, I probably need a brink or some sort of storage container to take the yeast and put that in. Are my tanks set up so that I can do cone-to-cone transfers with yeast once I want to go from one batch to another? And then it also is really going to matter how many tanks you're going to have, because a lot of smaller breweries, they open up and you have a brew house and you maybe have, 3 to 5 fermenters, which is pretty typical for new breweries that I see opening up, especially on the smaller scale, plan on doing less than 1,000 barrels a year, say. uh, you really can't run too many different kinds of yeast if you only have that many fermenters. You need somewhere to put it, and storage and yeast it's a diminishing rate of return. The longer that you have to sit on something, or sit on a batch of yeast, the less viability, the worse viability is going to get over time. And so, it also is going to matter. This isn't something that I see a whole lot anymore, because it seems like everybody realized it pays to get proper equipment. But I remember breweries opening up and they didn't have temperature control. They were just going to do, plastic conical, or I've even seen, unjacketed fermenter, even stainless steel fermenters that don't have temperature control. And thus the equipment now dictates what kind of beer you can make. If you had that kind of setup, I would say you should go heavy on the Saison, heavy on Belgian strains. And then, there are now, this wasn't the case, 10 years ago, but there are a lot of strains out there, a lot of them coming out of Northern Europe that seem to be able to ferment at really hot temperatures. And so I've seen breweries open up and they just plan on using these Quake strains, and they can make an IPA at 90 degrees. But there are certain strains that are capable of doing that. So knowing, it can go two ways. You can, like I said, you can take the yeast and you can dictate what equipment you're going to buy based on what kinds of yeast you're going to use and how many different types of yeast you're going to use. Or you can say, this is the equipment that I've got. What type of yeast should I get? And another thing, I guess, the next step in this would
seems
maybe
to be frozen. Let's see. We're resetting.
Oh, sorry about that.
There we go.
Am I there? Okay. Sorry. I don't know where I froze up there, but I was going into, you can either have the equipment dictating the yeast that you're going to use, or the yeast dictating the type of equipment that you have to buy. And knowing what you're going to do there. A really good, at this point, while you still have the brewery in planning and you're trying to decide what kind of yeast, I think it's a good idea to make a relationship with a yeast provider, because you can reach out and ask these questions too. Like, maybe you don't know exactly what the best yeast to make the German Hefeweizen that you're trying to make is going to be, but you reach out to a yeast supplier and they can say, this strain's good, but it's not good for this and this and this reason, or it's great for this and this. And with the equipment that you have, that's going to work out great. So having somebody that you can bounce questions off of is really going to help make a lot of these decisions early on. And this is also the stage where you're going to start making decisions on what equipment you're going to buy. So expense comes up. It's going to, you're writing your business plan. You need to write those numbers into your business plan, so that you're not shocked later when you try to buy a yeast brink and figure out how much it's going to cost, or, you find out that you can't run as much glycol as you'd like to. So maybe that changes the amount of tanks that you're going to have, or something like that. So,
does the cost of the yeast have any relation to the amount of customer service or knowledge that you'll find in a specific yeast lab? Like, how do you vet your different yeast labs?
I would say that any good yeast lab is not going to ask you first how much money you're going to spend before they start offering advice. That's not how we would like to do things, and I hope that none of my employees would treat anybody like that. Obviously, I like talking to new breweries, because new breweries do tend to order a lot of yeast. So forming that relationship from my side, like, absolutely, I'll do whatever, I give any kind of information or help out however I can, because I know that new breweries tend to order a lot of yeast just getting started, and they're figuring out their brands, are deciding, maybe they thought they were going to be IPA heavy, but it turns out they make excellent lagers and they end up going that direction. So, there's a lot of that, but I wouldn't say that there's some amount. I do know that, I'm a liquid yeast provider. What we grow in-house is all liquid yeast that we send out. We are actually getting into the dry yeast game, as a repacking. So we're actually having it manufactured outside, bringing it in, and then we're going to, test it and send it out. And that, after 10 years, I've been trying not to bring dry yeast in, but as an expense, dry yeast is a lot less expensive than liquid yeast. And so from what I've heard and what I understand talking to customers, you do get less customer service from a dry yeast provider, because you can't just call Fermentis. You're buying it from BSG. BSG is not a yeast company. You can't exactly get a hold of Fermentis directly. So it is one of those situations where you kind of get what you pay for in those instances. One of the things we're hoping to do with bringing in dry yeast is to offer that customer service for customers that are buying that product as well. But I do know that usually that's kind of the trade-off. Like, I'm, only using dry yeast, so therefore something goes wrong, I'm kind of left to my own devices to figure that out.
Do you find that it's common for people that are coming from a homebrewing background to start out using dry yeast? Or is
It
that not
seems
necessarily
more
equivalent?
it seems more typical for them to use liquid yeast.
Okay.
I think when you're doing home brewing, the availability so with dry yeast, there's only a couple options. Usually there's not, 5 to 10 strains that all make the exact same style of beer. The dry yeast companies find one that seems to dry really well, and then that product is then done in mass. It's way, the size of the facilities that they're growing this yeast in. It's really hard to change over products. So they'll go with one big one. So you do lose a lot of the variety when you go to a dry yeast. And so typically what I see with homebrewers is that they love using some obscure strain that only comes from White Labs, like during this 2-month period every once in a while. And that, that's one of the beauties of doing homebrewing. And so I do think that most breweries that are starting off will typically use liquid yeast because they get to do anything that they want. And then what I see is that when finances start to become real, they will start to consider using a dry yeast. And there's certain beers that I think, a dry yeast does just fine. I've got arguments as to why liquid yeast is better in a bunch of different directions, but I'm also not in the business of telling my customers how to run their business. So we, I think that there is an absolute place for dry yeast within production. And, the bigger the production, the more it becomes making sense in a lot of cases, unless you have the equipment and the sophistication and the scheduling to get a lot of generations out of your yeast. Because I've got customers that get 20 generations out of one pitch of yeast. So at that point, the cost is, very negligible. But it does, it is a factor, especially if you're doing, taking a pitch of liquid yeast and using it once and then just dumping it down the drain is kind of heartbreaking. It is an expensive product to do something like that. So a lot of breweries in planning don't care though. A lot of times it's, we got to get beer out there and we just want to get beer in the hands of our customers and open the doors and get this thing going. So there does tend to be quite a bit of, I would say overspending on yeast in the beginning for most breweries that I've worked with.
Do you find that as time passes, you said sometimes they'll consider dry yeast. Do you find that they do more propagation then?
I think that most customers are not repitching dry yeast nearly as much as a savvy liquid yeast user will. And that's typically, I've talked to customers that just say, look, I don't have time. I don't have a microscope. I don't want to have a lab. I don't want to deal with any of the quality stuff. So we'll just pitch a new brick in every time. And it's too expensive to do that with a liquid pitch. So they're not trying to get, a bunch of generations. I've talked to customers that they do pitch their dry yeast a couple of times. I don't know many that'll go out, like I said, like 20 generations. And that does run a risk. Like if you picked up a contamination on, generation 4 and carried that out to 16, you'd have a lot of contaminated beer. So there's a risk, and there are a lot of reasons why you'd want to set up a lab if you were going to try to start getting that many generations out of stuff. But there are plenty of breweries that are doing it without the lab. So it really is it's up to the kind of how much time the brewer wants to invest in stretching out that liquid pitch.
So you can propagate without a microscope.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can do all of it. Like brewers, I mean, they grow more yeast than we do, to be honest. Like from a volume standpoint, I'm really giving, when you're buying liquid yeast from a yeast provider, you're buying kind of a starter culture. You're buying just the little, it really is only a fourth to an eighth as much yeast as end up fermenting out that particular batch. And then you'll take that and you can collect it and pitch into 2 different beers. And, so that one, when we say generations, oftentimes brewers think that's just, okay, so you take yeast from this batch and you put it in another one, that's 1 generation, you put it into another one, that's 2 generations, right? Well, oftentimes you'll grow 2 to 3 times as much yeast in one batch as you need to inoculate the next ones. So 1 pitch of yeast will make enough to inoculate 2 more fermenters. So Gen 1 is really double the volume of the first one. And then you can do that again and again. And I mean, you can get exponential volume out of a single pitch of yeast if you are planning it right.
So how soon do you have to pitch the next generation for it to be okay?
So the sooner the better. It is best to monitor your fermentation. And as soon as you've gone through your diacetyl rest and crashed that that yeast within a day or two, you're pulling it, and the best thing to do is just cone to cone, go straight into another batch. So as the yeast goes through its cycle and it goes into its crash phase and it's dormant for very few days, and then it immediately goes into another beer and then goes right through exponential growth and fermentation phase. And yeast loves to be in that just constant up and down cycle of growth, fermentation, drop, growth, fermentation, crash. It's actually a lot better for it to be crashed than it is to just go from one warm batch to another batch to another batch to another batch. It likes to go into cycles and set up its glycogen reserves is good for the overall metabolism of the yeast. But yeah, I mean, the other thing that is important that I think if you want to try to get the best bang for your buck with liquid yeast is to pick one to be your house strain. So you're going in and you're saying, I might make 5 different types, or different kinds of beer that require different types of yeast, but 80% of my beer is made with one. And there are a lot of strains that are great for making, most English strains, most American styles. So you can do all the, with the same yeast, you should be able to do a West Coast and East Coast, the stout, your porter, your English mild. And there may be cases where there's a strain that is slightly better. But this house yeast may be 95% as good and, still make you able to reuse that yeast over and over and over again, in the pursuit of saving money, because, especially with the current climate, that seems to be on everybody's mind. That's a really big piece. And yeast you can use less hops, you can use less, but you can't completely cut them out. You can, usually it's very hard to cut grain out of the grain bill without, reducing gravity or flavor. But yeast, you can figure out how to run it for longer and save money within a brewery. And so a lot of that comes down to scheduling, sophistication with your brewing practices, and having a house yeast. The breweries that I know that are getting 20 generations, that's their house yeast. They're not getting 20 gens out of their obscure Belgian beer that they're making or something like that.
That makes sense. So in order to do, I guess maybe what's the minimum kind of lab to do some QA QC? Like how do you do this and catch infections or catch issues? And then if you were doing it in a perfect world, what would that lab look like?
Oh, so I've seen labs that make me so jealous. Some breweries out there just have all the toys, all the analytical equipment. As far as the minimum amount that you need, I don't think you should run a brewery without a hydrometer. You need a way to get gravity. And that, brewers know that for other reasons. What you're doing, that's a metric that you're taking that is going to tell you how healthy the yeast is. Another piece of equipment that I think everybody should have, it's very, very inexpensive, is a pH meter. And maybe even buy a good one. You can get pH meters for $30, the little sticks that go in. And I do always suggest that you get the standards so that you're calibrating your pH probe. Even if you've got one of the $30 ones, you're calibrating it regularly so that you know it works. But for $300, you can buy a really nice pH meter. And I think that if I had to pick one metric that I could take from a brewery, so that includes, cell counting and gravity and, dissolved oxygen, everything, all of it. pH would be the number one thing that I would take if I could only take one, because based on your pH, I could tell you what your gravity's at. I could tell you if the fermentation's done. I could tell you how well, when it started and how healthy the yeast is. And it's really hard to do that from one batch. So you take pHs and you get a curve in one batch. That doesn't tell you a whole lot, unless it's way out of spec. But if you do this 10 times again with the same exact beer, your pH curve should be identical. And if there are situations where yeast actually produces acidity just through its life cycle, it creates a pH gradient between the inside of the yeast and then the outside, and that facilitates uptake of glucose. So it's bringing in glucose within the cell through having a pH gradient. So it wants the pH to be lower on the outside of the cell as inside the cell. And anybody that's tracked pH through a fermentation will see that it starts to drop off and it goes down, and then it'll level out, and then it upticks just a little bit right at the end. And what that is the yeast stopping that, trying to create that pH gradient, realizing that it's out of fermentable sugars to take in, and it gives up the gradient. Essentially, you see the pH uptick just a little bit, and it's ready for storage and repitching. If you see the pH take too long to start going down, that's a good sign that your yeast is a little bit stressed out and you maybe either underpitched or there's something going on. If you see the pH doesn't go as low as it typically does, or if that uptick at the end of the tail is bigger than normal, that's a really good sign that there's something going on. There's a problem with the yeast. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly what's wrong with it, but I could tell you that there is something, and you should always see the same exact pH curve over and over and over again from a given fermentation. So, more than gravity, because there are plenty of times where you'll pitch yeast and it's really at the end of its life cycle, and it ferments and it does bring the gravity all the way down, but it's not healthy. You really shouldn't repitch that yeast. And, gravity in conjunction with pH could tell you a whole lot about what's going on with the fermentation. So I oftentimes have customers ask me like, hey, I want to start a lab. I want to get a microscope. We want to start counting cells. And I oftentimes suggest, why don't you just start really taking meticulous notes of your gravities and your pH to start with and see if you can tell anything, because I think that you could look at the gravity curve and the pH curve from the previous batch and tell yourself whether or not it's a good idea to repitch that yeast.
Oh.
Next step, getting a microscope, being able to physically look at the yeast. That's a very powerful thing. But it is a step that I see a lot of breweries go and they buy a microscope and they get all excited and they take a class on how to do cell counting, and they might even do it for a month. And then pretty soon somebody gets busy. You don't see, if nothing's changing, if there's not a problem, it's just another thing that you're recording. And then that microscope is like in the corner of the lab covered in mill dust and nobody uses it anymore. So cell counting is great if you do it and you repeatedly do it and it becomes SOP, just something that you're doing in the brew house regularly to help drive decision making. Because realistically, the cell count and the viability of the yeast all should be what's dictating, should I reuse this yeast? How is this batch going to go? If you're doing it because there's a fermentation that's stalled or something's going wrong, it's already too late. I mean, you can kind of tell, but clearly the problem's already presented itself.
Mm-hmm. So if you were going basics and you just had your pH and maybe one or two other things, do you need to have a separate space that you call a lab, or not really?
I wouldn't say so. Neither of those are sterile metrics. pH doesn't need to be sterile, neither does the gravity. And plenty of breweries are just taking these just on the bench in the brewery. It's pretty dirty. That being said, I think that it really does help to have a space that is yours if you're trying to do lab stuff. If you're really trying to take quality control in a brewery seriously, just having that physical space to separate yourself from all the chaos that's going on in production and set yourself up, I think is a good first step. So if you have the option to have that, I mean, it can be a closet with like a desk in it, that's fine. But it is nice to have that space somewhat separate. Do you absolutely have to have it? No. And just to do those simple, gravity and pH, and that's something that almost every brewery that I know of has and are taking. I just don't know how often they're taking it or how much they actually look at the pH as a useful metric outside of just, is the beer sour.
Right.
Once you start getting into things like plating and running PCR that are sterile processes, or at least like you don't want to contaminate them outside of what's going on in the fermenter. So you don't want to contaminate the sample in the room just because you milled in an hour ago and there's still dust settling. That's when I think you do need like a totally separate area, a separate lab, somewhere to completely get away from the environment that's going on in the brewery. But otherwise it's mostly just for sanity purposes, I think.
Gotcha. And PCR stands for?
Polymerase chain reaction. So yeah, I should explain that a little bit. PCR is, now we're kind of getting into the advanced level stuff. A lot of breweries, if brand new breweries that are opening up will get PCR at the gate if they know that this is something that they're going to use. And what polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, is it was developed a couple decades ago. It used to be very, very expensive to run. It's a process by which genes within the sample that is taken are tagged with fluorescent dye, and you're able to replicate those tagged sequences exponentially to get a fluorescence. And so you're taking a sample of yeast or bacteria or whatever it is, and you're grinding up all the DNA. So you just got a bunch of DNA in solution, And then you're adding what are called primers, which are the little fluorescent tagged pieces of DNA that tag to the DNA in question. And if it's there, it'll tag it and then amplify it. And if it's not there, it won't. So then the instrument looks for that fluorescent amplification and tells you whether or not something is present or is not. So, it's a really cool tool if you're in a brewery and you're saying, hey, does this beer that I just canned have a contaminant in it? You're able to grab that sample, run it on PCR within a couple hours, get an answer, which is huge because plating, which is, the more traditional way of doing quality control, takes days because it's limited by the growth rate of the organism you're trying to grow. So
Right.
you need to incubate it. You need to give it some time. If you plate something and you look at it the next day, like chances are nothing's growing yet. And you don't want to just think nothing's there because you didn't give it enough time. So in a brewery setting, oftentimes time is of the essence. You absolutely need to figure out what's going on right now because everyone's freaking out and they need to know there's an entire canning line and 10 employees that are stagnant waiting for you to make a decision on whether or not you're going to can this. So PCR is really nice in that case. And I think if I was in a brewery that was putting anything in a can or doing any kind of distro, it would be something that I would want so that I had a backup for anything that could go on in the market. Like if somebody's coming to you and telling you that your keg, something's wrong with the keg, or there's some cans that are exploding, it would really be nice to have that piece of information on the front end that you did before you sent it out to say, look, I checked,
Right.
everything was clean. That's why I made this decision.
Gotcha. So backing up more towards basic level, let's talk about storage.
Mhm.
How do you store it? How do you take care of it? You mentioned yeast brink, maybe a little more about what is that?
Yeah. So with yeast brinks, I get asked this all the time because there are very, very fancy yeast brinks that you can buy that have agitator paddles and all kinds of sample ports and things. In my opinion, the best yeast brink is the most simple yeast brink because the thing that is going to the worst thing that can happen when storing yeast is to contaminate it. So I've seen yeast brinks that actually contaminate one yeast with another yeast that you had in house. It's not like it was a foreign something, but if you don't clean that yeast brink completely and then you put another yeast in it, chances are that previous yeast is going to, stick around. And even if you're using cleaning chemicals, even if you're flushing it with 180-degree water, if you've got shadows, if there's somewhere like contaminants seem to figure out somewhere to hang out in almost all cases. So I think, there's some really, really simple like keg. GW Kent makes a nice brink that's basically just a keg shell with like they've added a 4-inch triclamp port up top, which helps to harvest the yeast into. And then, usually it's got a in and out tube so that you can attach and with air, or, you can even, some of them you can flush, you can put in line with your wort stream. So you're knocking out and it's knocking out through the brink and inoculating the tank as it's going in. There's a bunch of different versions of this, but the more simple, the better. I think a bucket is a fantastic yeast brink as long as you can sanitize that bucket, the same as you can sanitize, any stainless piece of equipment. They work great. Ideally, you're not leaving things in this brink for longer than a day or two. I would go, a week. Some people ask what's the absolute maximum. I mean, there really isn't. It's hard for me to say you absolutely can keep yeast for 2 weeks because in some cases, I'm sure that's fine. And in some cases it's not. It really depends on how healthy the yeast was going into the brink. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that yeast, even after finishing a beer and harvested it into a brink, seems like it shouldn't continue to evolve CO2 because it finished all the sugar, but they do continue to make CO2 and create pressure. So if you're harvesting yeast into a brink that's completely sealed, sometimes, brewers think that's a great idea because nothing can get in. But if the yeast is sitting there creating pressure and there's nowhere for that pressure to escape, I've seen brinks completely 100% dead. Like the above 20 PSI, it'll kill all the yeast inside that brink. And what looked like super healthy yeast going in gets pitched into a tank and is just totally gone. Like nothing ever starts. It's 100% dead. And I've done cell counts on tanks where there's tons of yeast in there and none of it's alive. And oftentimes it's just as simple as have some way to vent. And one thing that, I've talked to a lot of brewers about is, hey, it's cool. I go in and I vent the yeast every day. So every day I go in and I open the purge valve and I vent out all the pressure. And, pressure builds up after a day, but I vent it out. And that's great if you're keeping up with it all the time. But the problem with that type of setup is, what if you forget? What if you come in every day? Do you leave it over the weekend and now it went 3 days instead of the 1 day? Like almost never is it going to be a case where that yeast is getting burped regularly. So put a blow off on it. Just a tube going into a bucket is a fantastic. It works for homebrewers. It works. That's all your fermenters are doing is just tube into a blow off bucket, usually outside. So setting something like that up with your yeast brink, even if it's in the fridge for a week, is probably the best way to make sure pressure isn't killing your yeast in storage. And then next is feeding it. There's kind of conflicting opinions on what's best here, because realistically, if the yeast has gone through its full fermentation and dropped off and finished all its sugars, and then cleaned up all the secondary metabolites, cleaned up all the VDK, and did all the activity and it's going to do, and then builds up its glycogen reserves and goes dormant. That's all really good for its cycle. And so originally, or early on, I was always under the impression that the best thing to do is not feed it, to just leave it, because you don't want to wake it up a little bit, even if it's in the fridge. But we've just, through working with customers, we found that giving it a little bit of food. So we send little yeast feeds out with our yeast that you can use before or after in this case. And I mean, what our yeast feed is just a very, very concentrated malt with a bunch of nutrients in it. So giving the yeast a little something to chew on, but then also still keeping it in the cold room, from what I've seen, keeps the viability up very, very well. They need something to chew on. And I think a lot of the times, like, I've had customers kind of question, like, wait a minute, you're telling me that I can only keep yeast for like a week, but you also tell me that the shelf life on your product is months, and like, I think, a lot of the companies out there are claiming 3, 4, 5, 6 months on shelf life for liquid yeast. So that's very contradictory to what we're telling our customers to do. And a lot of that is because when a yeast lab grows yeast, we're giving it the most nutrient rich environment it possibly can, because we're not making a product that then the beer has to be consumed. I make a ton of beer that we just dumped down the drain, and for a good reason, because it would be awful. It's oxidized, it's full of nutrients, it's got all these things in it that doesn't make for good drinking, but it is a good environment for the yeast to hang out in after it's done with all the sugars. There's still plenty of nutrients and things for it to keep itself healthy and active. So that's kind of a difference. And by feeding your yeast after, knowing that you're going to have to stick it in storage for a little bit, and I'm not talking like giving it a ton, just a little bit of some malt that maybe you've got some dry malt extract that you can mix it up. It's better if you're adding a high gravity, low volume to that yeast brings, so that it's just a tiny bit of sugar and a tiny bit of nutrient for it to chew on. Seems to be the best case for storage.
Gotcha. And you store refrigerated?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry. That should add yeah. 4 degrees Celsius, between, 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit seems to be the best storage condition. So in your cold room. And I mean, it does help to know that your walk-in, I've been in a lot of breweries and their walk-in is nowhere near 50 degrees. It's, you know what I mean? It's way, way, way high because people are going in and out all the time. The closer to, 35 degrees that you can keep the yeast, the better. It'll keep it just in that storage process longer. And we've even seen with dry yeast, for instance, the biggest difference with dry yeast's viability over time, if you say open the packet and just leave it out exposed to the air, didn't seem to be the air. It's the refrigeration seems to make the biggest impact. So keeping it cold is the best way to keep yeast in.
I know one of the recommendations I hear over and over is to not store food in the same cooler as your beer, because the food people will be in and out all the time and it's hard to keep that.
Yeah. Any way to keep the fridge, especially if it's where you're storing the yeast, but even with the beer and everything else, I hadn't heard that, but that totally makes sense. All of this should be stored in the fridge that has the least action, because, if that's an option, a lot of times you only have one cold room.
Right. Can you use a regular refrigerator and just have something dedicated for yeast?
Absolutely. And I've got, plenty of customers that just have a refrigerator that they've either it's big enough that they can stick stuff on the shelves, or, they've removed the shelves to just use it like a big, storage refrigerator. But yeah, anything you've got, you can use a freezer that you've got on a temperature controller that holds it at refrigeration temperatures too. Like a lot of, home brewing, like the Keyser setup. So realistically, anything that's going to keep it in that refrigeration temperature is going to be good for the yeast and storage.
Gotcha. And you're kind of the most basic pointers of this batch is not usable again. That would be what are your basic cues to not
If
use that?
I think that looking at the fermentation profile, so usually in a brewery, you've brewed this beer before.
Right.
You've got some data, and I think that keeping records is probably that's step 1.0 as far as running a good quality control program is keeping records of everything so that you can always look back and find out if something's abnormal or this fermentation curve doesn't look like it. So the number one thing that I would do to ensure that or to decide whether or not yeast is usable for another batch is look at the fermentation. Did it start in a reason like the same amount of time that it always does? Did it take the normal amount of time to ferment? If it had a lag in the beginning and then took, maybe it's a normal 7-day fermentation, this one took 10, that's very eyebrow raising. There's a reason for that. And oftentimes it's because the yeast isn't very healthy. And this is all without the ability to take a cell count. You're just looking at look, this thing lagged for a little bit when we pitched it. It took some extra time to get through fermentation. And then another really big giveaway is lots of diacetyl produced and very little cleaned up. So if the derest takes longer than normal, or there seems to be an abnormally high VDK load, and VDK diacetyl, same thing, you're going to get, those are all reasons to go, hey, maybe we shouldn't repitch this yeast. But if it's like that batch was the same as the 15 batches before it and it ripped and this beer tastes great and everything fermentation wise was textbook, without doing a cell count, I could almost tell you that it's fine to use it again. That's not a contaminant thing. God forbid you picked up something and now it's sour. But I mean, those are all things you should also pick up with your pH or, sensory is another. You don't need a big lab. Know what your beer tastes like. If there's, an off flavor in it and something's gone wrong, that's another reason maybe I would think about maybe there was an issue with this yeast and we should get another pitch. Or it's really nice, if you then have the ability to do a cell count or to look at the health of the yeasts, that would be a trigger. If cell counting is not something that you're doing regularly, if a fermentation takes some extra time or some diacetyl is an issue or something, that's a great time to start doing some cell counts and try to figure out if it's a viability issue.
Gotcha. And the data points that you're talking about taking during fermentation, how long it takes for fermentation to start,
Yep.
How long does the complete fermentation take? Are there other metrics in the process of fermentation that you recommend being tracked?
So for that, just first of all, for that fermentation curve, we're talking the gravity. That's the best way to track the fermentation. So you're taking, initial gravity, and then that should be pretty much flatline until you start getting, the yeast takes off and you get exponential growth, and then fermentation and the gravity starts to drop off. For the first couple batches, so you're a new brewery, you haven't done this, I would take a lot of sample points. I'd be taking gravity pretty regularly. And I'm talking I don't think it would be crazy to do it if you're there for an 8-hour day to take 2-3 gravities, within that day, or maybe even every 2 hours. The more data that you can collect and the more resolution that you can get to your data, because you're taking a lot of time points in the beginning, that'll help, because then later, so say you've done that 5 times and you've got these really great graphs and everything looks identical. Now you can spread out your time points for taking all of those a little bit wider. And as long as they're still hitting that graph where they should, that they're still in spec. If you're only doing 1 gravity a day, if it's landing on this graph and everything else being similar, looks very predictable, great, but that's not going to give you a ton of data right out the gate. So then other metrics I would take every time I take a pH, every time I take a gravity, I take a pH, because that's very easy. You've already got the sample right there. You can stick the pH meter in the hydrometer if you want to. You don't even have to have a different sampling vessel. So I would take those 2 pieces of information side by side. Third would be taking a cell count. If now you got to have, the microscope hemocytometer, I think in the beginning, it would be a really good idea to also be taking cell counts at all these sample points as well. And if you can do, cell counts every 2 hours, that's something that in industry, like in biofuels or pharma, that was pretty normal. 2-hour sample points. I don't really expect brewers to do that at a big, I'd love it if they did. It would be best case, you're taking a lot of sample points, but taking a cell count every 2 hours, if it's not your job and that's all you have to do, is a little bit excessive. So I think that, one a day, if you got one cell count a day, and you do it at you pitch, you do a cell count, you get a baseline gravity, or a baseline viability, baseline cell count. And then you go the next day and you're doing it always at the same time. So you really just want the data to make sense. So if you're taking the cell counts at the same time on the same beer with the same, grain bill, the cell count should be pretty much the same. You can mess with it if you underpitched or overpitched originally, but otherwise everything should lay on top of each other. So having those three metrics, pH, gravity, and cell count, I think you can almost tell everything you need to know about how that yeast is doing, as far as whether it's healthy, whether you should reuse it, and then diacetyl, if you're taking a measurement of that, that would be awesome. Sometimes it's just a sensory thing and you're waiting, but recognizing how much diacetyl is produced and how long it takes to clean it up is another thing that you could be, taking notes on and then comparing batch to batch.
And there's equipment to do that, or is that just sensory?
Sensory is the easiest way. Doing a forced diacetyl test is something, there's a lot out in the literature about how to do that properly. Because you heat up the sample a little bit to get most of the diacetyl to convert, because diacetyl is a tricky, yeast actually doesn't produce diacetyl. It produces acetolactate. And acetolactate converts the diacetyl outside of the cell. So you can have a situation where you're not tasting diacetyl because it's all in the form of acetolactate, but then that over time that will convert to diacetyl. And so if you thought you were clear early on, you might not be clear later. So doing that forced diacetyl test, heating up the sample, getting, ensuring that, you're not going to have an issue down the line is something that, a lot of brewers do. And a lot of them don't even heat it up. They just have a really great, nose for it or taste buds for it or whatever. I'm not a great diacetyl taster, so I would be awful at that and need to. There are analytical tests you can do, and there are companies out there, local lab testing companies like Firmly that'll run those tests for you. At a certain point, a lot of breweries get the equipment to be able to run those internally, and then they can take all the VDK samples that they want. And that's typically the big macro distribution breweries that have that type of equipment available, but it is really nice when you have it.
Right. So, in terms of QA/QC and sensory,
Mm-hmm.
Can you achieve some of that just by letting your sample warm up to room temperature?
Yeah, and giving it time. A microwave, if you have a microwave, you can heat it up. That's typically what people do. So it's not like a super sophisticated piece of equipment or the barrier entry to do a forced diacetyl. But yeah, letting it warm up, definitely, it's better if it's room temperature than it is when it's cold coming out of the tank. Mm-hmm. Or, coming across the tap or something like that too. So you'll recognize it more at that temperature. So, that is the diacetyl is also coming, so talking about people that are looking to start breweries, I would really get versed in how to taste for that if I was planning on being the brewer. If you're planning on starting a brewery and you're going to hire somebody with experience, chances are they know this and they're able to do it. But if you're starting the brewery on your own and you're planning on being the brewer as well, one of the biggest no-nos I see with breweries amongst other brewers is letting beer get to consumers that has diacetyl. It's almost unforgivable. And people that are super tasters of it just blown away. And that's one of the things that I've seen new breweries open up and they put their beer on tap and maybe even when they brewed the beer, everything was fine. And then, people from the community walk into the soft opening and they're like, you absolutely can't serve that beer. So it is one of those flaws that you don't get a lot of slack for anymore.
Yeah. Understood. So in terms of QA/QC and sensory, from a yeast perspective, what are you tasting and what are you looking for other than diacetyl when you're doing your QA/QC? Is it all yeast?
So usually, at that point, hopefully by the time you're tasting the beer as a finished product, most of the yeast is off, unless it's a Hefeweizen or something, you've let the yeast crash. So if you're tasting yeast flavor, then oftentimes that's because you've had some autolysis or some other event that caused the yeast to die within the beer that then kind of let everything from the inside of the yeast out. And you get all kinds of weird, kind of umami flavor to a beer. It's not good if you've left the beer. Oh, another thing that I didn't really bring up is leaving beer on yeast. That's something that a lot of like, okay, so how soon do I need to pull it? Because, it's convenient to just leave all the yeast at the bottom of the cone and let it just sit there. But if you do that and you do it for too long and the yeast starts to die at the bottom of the cone, that can affect the flavor of the beer as well as the viability of the yeast. If you were planning on reusing that yeast, you should get it off the cone as soon as you possibly can, because for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, it's cold and it's all crashed out. Those are great things, but yeast, there's such thing as hydrostatic pressure. And depending on how big your tank is, a 5-barrel tank is about 6 feet high, and that's about 2 psi of hydrostatic pressure. So if you think about it, you go into some of these breweries and they've got these huge 60-barrel vessels that are 30 feet tall or something like that. All of that hydrostatic pressure sitting on top of the yeast in the cone is going to be a stressor, and can cause yeast to die and viability problems on the back end. So that is like a sensory thing that you can pick up in a finished beer that may have been something that was caused by the yeast. Another thing is ester profile, because if you've properly pitched yeast, there's a lot of yeast that create an ester profile that is pretty standard for them. But then if a beer is overly estery, or there's flavors that are going on, like and sometimes it doesn't just have to be esters, it can be phenolics that are caused by underpitching, and then there's some that can be caused by overpitching. So I know I did a blog post for Started Brewery that is kind of the importance of pitch rate, and all of those things are very, it's important that you're pitching the right amount of yeast too, because that can affect the end product in a lot of ways. Like I was saying, underpitching can have all kinds of adverse effects. It can cause a beer to be too sweet because it stalled out because it didn't quite finish. I've heard of beers having all kinds of I used to think that overpitching wasn't, it was really hard to cause problems with overpitching. And as far as like fermentation profile, you're not going to see huge issues if you overpitch, as far as like the beer is going to finish. It should hit the gravity as normal, everything work out. But then there are these weird kind of off flavors that I've noticed in situations where it seems like brewers are over pitching. Sometimes they're just pulling everything from the cone and putting it in the next beer, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the best practice.
Gotcha. And you were saying that if for example, you're not intending to use that yeast again, if you let the beer sit on it for too long, there can be off flavors in the beer and the tank
too. Yeah. So you've even if you're not planning on using it, even if you were going to dump it down the drain anyway, there is a point at which it's best to take the yeast off of the beer. And I would say that's when you are sure that you've cleared your diacetyl and you no longer need the yeast to convert diacetyl into acetonin and get rid of that off flavor or do any of the kind of secondary metabolism. So after fermentation's over, you still leave the yeast on that cone for a little bit to kind of let those things settle out, and then pull it. Just get it away from the beer so that it doesn't have a chance to die and or cause any kind of adverse flavors afterwards.
So would that adverse flavor, if it was left to sit on the yeast, vary depending on the kind of the yeast, or is there kind of a standard off flavor that goes with that?
I mean, it is really that, like, it's kind of like this umami flavor. I've also heard, I'm trying to think the off flavor that's most commonly tied to yeast autolysis, like Mercaptan, I think, or one of the, kind of strange. It's an unsettling flavor. It's not like sour, and it's not like sulfur. It's dead yeast flavor. It's tough to explain, but it's not pleasant. And is totally avoidable by just moving it along. And I'm saying this like it's super easy to just decide when you're gonna. There's all kinds of other factors that are involved in when you can pull your yeast and when you can repitch it. And these are all things that I was saying. It's part of that sophistication in doing your planning and your scheduling. So you've got another beer right on the back end of this beer, so you've got somewhere to put that yeast when you're done with it. And then sometimes you're brewing a beer before that yeast is ready. And I've got a lot of customers that do something called a soft crash, where they just drop the temp by like 5 degrees towards the end of the fermentation, and they try to get yeast to drop out, or at least enough that they can collect it and then pitch that into another batch, which you can get away with. Like I was saying, you usually grow about 2 to 3 times as much yeast as you need to repitch another batch of equal volume. So in those cases, you should be able to pull enough to pitch into another batch and keep that going. It's not the best case scenario because you didn't let the yeast go through its full metabolism. But in a case where, say, you're going to dry hop a beer, you don't want to pull yeast up from a dry hopped beer. And that, I guess I should have gone into that as well. Any kind of adjunct that you're adding post fermentation while the yeast is still in solution is going to be all mixed up in that cone. So, if you've got to pull yeasts from a dry hopped beer, I would hope that you're putting it into a beer, the exact same beer, because you're going to carry over all that hop particulate and all kinds of, some stuff that maybe you wouldn't want to do. It is absolutely best to pull it before you do that, before you dry hop.
So if you use adjuncts, it needs to be pulled before the adjunct goes in.
It's best case. I mean, some adjuncts are less harmful than others, but, are less prevalent. If your adjunct is just all sugar based, it's oftentimes not a problem because it'll just all get fermented out. But if you're going to add a ton of hops, the hop matter is gonna fall out with everything. And if you're going to add, some sort of fruit that is, raspberries or something, like, your yeast is going to be pink when you try to pull it out of there. So, it's something to think about before, if you need to use that yeast.
Again, got it.
Yeah.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left. So in the biggest of pictures, what have we missed?
I mean, an hour is nowhere near as enough time. I apologize. And I have a tendency to go off on tangents, so hopefully I didn't waste a ton of time there. But overall, thinking about it, because I really do think that a lot of breweries and planning, especially from the home brewer starting a brewery side, they just assume they're going to do everything like they did while they were home brewing, and it's really expensive to do that. It's really expensive to buy a new pitch every single time, and it's really expensive to use a different yeast for every different type of beer. So kind of wrapping your head and having a plan, just like you have a business plan that says how you're going to execute and hire employees and make your tap room function properly. Having a plan as to how the brew house is going to run and how many beers you're going to be brewing per week and how many different yeast strains you're going to need. Should come into a factor. And I mean, us at Yeast Labs, we have yeast in stock. You can call me today in a pinch and get that. And we've kind of facilitated a lot of bad habits that breweries can have these days, because they can just order yeast from whenever and get it that day, or at worst the next day in a lot of cases. It's better to have planning, that you spend a lot of money doing that. You don't want to make mistakes and need to scramble, and yeast is not an inexpensive enough product to be able to kind of always be making those last second decisions as far as management goes. Right. So take it seriously as a process, because you're manufacturing. It's not just owning a brewery. It's a passion project. Our one of our slogans is art plus science equals beer, because you're a chef and you're a scientist and you're doing all this really cool stuff and you've got this great product. But at the end of the day, it's a manufacturing operation. If you're lucky enough to be able to run it like a passion project and make whatever beer you want to make when you want to make it, then that's fantastic. But what I've seen from a profitability standpoint is you got to run it like a production facility.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, with some responsible, accountable planning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that 4-letter word.
Yeah.
Well, thank you a ton. I don't see any questions in our comment section, so I think we're good for today. If somebody wanted to reach out to you with questions, how would you recommend that they do that?
Yeah. So John with an H at inlandislandyeast.com is my email. You can also find there's a ask us questions link on the website. If you go in there, that goes directly to us. We're a small company, so anything that you reach out correspondence wise to Inland Island, I will get a hold of. And I have if there's several presentations that I've done on, I didn't even get into nutrients. That's like a whole subject that, that could be a whole other hour on its own. I didn't get into a lot of the topics that, I've done presentations on just nutrients before, and just hop creep before, and, more specific to brewing than just how to start up and things to think about when you're going. So absolutely reach out to me.
Gotcha. Sounds great. Thank you again to Craft Beer Professionals, to Andrew, to Amanda. John, thank you again. And I look forward to whatever the next deep dive is. I think we should do that.
Well, let's continue it. This can be
Awesome.
step one.
There we go.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks to everybody who came to watch. And we're in 2024, but this will be posted forever. So you may be watching this a couple years from now, and John will still be available, I trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good
Thank you.
afternoon.
You as well.
Thanks. Bye-bye.